what I can bring to it is, I'm an academic who's been working for a long time on, amongst other things, history in the region. So I guess from that point of view, I'm kind of an outsider, and maybe it's useful having someone here who's not Somali to talk about it from the perspective of having studied the kind of history and the culture and the politics and so on. So I'm not trying to talk to you as if, like, this is my history. This is my work, it's your history. So, but actually on that level, I think it is really important that you kind of know, we all know where we come from, where the history of the sort of area is, where the history of the culture is and everything. Now, that said, that history spans 1,000 years. We're not going to cover that in this session. In fact, 1884 to 1991 is like 107 years. We're not even going to do that good a job of digging really deep into that, because 107 years in 2 hours, there's a lot happens in 107 years. So all I want to do is I want to cover a few things. The kind of idea for the evening is that I'm going to speak for a few minutes, then we're going to have some time for some discussion. And then I'll speak for a few more minutes about the next period, and then we discuss it. And the idea of doing like that is really that I don't want to stand here and do you like 2 hours or an hour of lecture on Somali history. I'd much rather there's a kind of discussion and we talk about the things that interest you. So I'll do my best to pick out some bits that I think are important and that maybe are a little bit provocative in the sense of provoking some kind of discussion. There are a lot of notes here on the PowerPoint. I'm not going to talk about all of them. So if you see something on there that I don't talk about and you feel like bringing it up, bring it up. So okay, that's the kind of introductory bit. Version of a company that they would use to try and colonize southern Somalia. Now, their progress was really slow. There was a lot of resistance very early on, from the very beginning. And the Italians were never that committed to it to start with. It was only with Mussolini, when he came to power, that he really saw the whole project as something that he took to heart. And there's an account of how he used to complain to his colleagues that somehow the Italian military defeat by Ethiopia at the Battle of Adwa was a stain on the Italian kind of, sense of glory, and that had to be avenged. And the way they were going to avenge that was to retake Ethiopia. And they were going to do that by actively colonizing Eritrea in the north and Somalia in the south. And they were going to create a kind of pincer movement, and then they were going to move in and take over the whole of Ethiopia and move into Addis. Now, eventually they did that, but hardly for any time at all. So, and the process of taking Somalia was very gradual, very bloody, very brutal, and it sped up a lot in Mussolini's time when they pushed up, and it was only then that they took the Majeerteen and Hobyo Sultanates. So it was only in the 20th century that those fell. So some of the last independent states of Africa to be colonized. Of course, one of the most famous forms of resistance to colonialism was the Darwish movement. And Muhammad Abdullah Hassan was really significant and still remains significant in Somali history in terms of the way that he created this movement. Now, significant doesn't mean necessarily 100% popular. There are divided opinions on him. Of course, the British had an issue with him because he was fighting their colonial effort. Although even that wasn't consistent. To start with, they weren't that worried about him. They just thought he was someone that was coming along and starting to create some kind of liaison between different clans in some of the areas that the British weren't that fussed on trying to rule directly. But eventually, his resistance to British rule became really important, and it broke out into full conflict. He also resisted Italian rule in the area that's now Puntland. So that, for a while, the Italians and the British united to try and push him out. Then he signed a peace deal with the Italians, and eventually he was brought down, actually he was brought down by flu. That's what he died of, probably. But what happened before then was the first Air Force-based bombardment of his fortifications in Tele in the Nugal Valley. So that kind of ends that period, and I said I'm going to talk really short. That's the short bit I'm going to talk about. So I've raised a few of the points that I think are quite significant. You just saw a whole lot more stuff here that you might want to pick up on. But what I would like to have now is a kind of discussion where you maybe bring up things that you're interested in, talk amongst yourselves, talk to each other. Let's talk in collective so that everyone can hear. Or I'm happy to answer questions or to be a part of the conversation as well. I won't try and be diplomatic about this. British diplomacy is a very weird thing. The current situation where we don't exactly know what it is the British want to do diplomatically is not new. They were the same in terms of their relationships with Ethiopia, the Italians, and so on. In relation to the Hode, there were different British officials wanting different things, putting different ideas. So some thought giving the Hode to Ethiopia was a good idea because it was a way of buying favor with the Ethiopians at a time when they thought it would be politically expeditious to do so. There were others that were dead set against it. So there were people that were arguing very strongly that it was not a good idea. And actually, when the British made the agreement, initially nothing happened. They made the agreement, but it wasn't enforced. So for many, many years, the Hode was officially part of Ethiopia, but no one really knew that because it didn't matter. There was no control over the border. People were still moving the same and everything. It was only in the 1950s when they started enforcing that border that there were major protests in Somaliland because they realized what was happening. So it was a mess, actually, diplomatically. There was a point when the British realized that what they were doing was going to be so unpopular, it was going to be a problem in the future. And so they tried to find a way of buying the Ethiopians off. So they tried to sell them at one stage Sola on the basis that that would give them access to a port and they would just have that channel up beside Djibouti from Sola into Ethiopia. And in return, they wouldn't give up Ethiopia wouldn't gain the Hode. But Ethiopia was like, no way, you've promised us this big area, we're going to take that big area. So they weren't interested in Sola at that point. So they tried all sorts of things. They realized that it was not a good idea. Eventually, they were kind of forced into it by Ethiopia, because Ethiopia, as I said before, were actually quite a lot of the time, they played the politics better than the colonial powers, the other colonial powers. They were a colonial power. There was then a new constitution developed, and there was a referendum held to decide whether to adopt that constitution. The northern political parties, by then, were already starting to get worried about what they saw as insufficient British Somaliland influence in the setting up of this new united Somalia. So the biggest political parties at the time in Somaliland urged a boycott of the referendum. The referendum in the end overwhelmingly endorsed the constitution. But only about 100,000 people in Somaliland in the British protectorate voted in that constitution, and those who voted overwhelmingly voted against. So it meant that there was already this problematic relationship where people in Somaliland were feeling, rightly or wrongly, pissed off that they hadn't had enough input into the formation of United Somalia. Now, there's a very strong argument to say, actually, they should have had more input. They could have had more input. They didn't. They rushed into union. And there were people within Somaliland who were urging more caution. One of the interesting facts of Somaliland political life at that time was that one of the big parties in Somaliland, the NUF, was led by a guy called Michael Mariano, who you might have heard of, a Somali, who was also a Catholic, which is, I think, interesting in Somali history. Now, he was actually a pretty accomplished politician by that stage. He'd been active in politics for a while. He was one of the ones that was urging more restraint. Now, he actually lost power. His party wasn't successful in winning elections after that, partly because his message of caution wasn't in line with the kind of enthusiasm from Somalilanders, from British protectorate Somalilanders, to unite with Somalia. So, although he was very popular for a long time and won several elections, there was a key election where his party lost all seats except for Michael Mariano's own seat in Adagavo. So partly that is a sign of exactly how much enthusiasm there was for union from the north as well as the south. In fact, the south, there were even more cautious voices. So what that led to was a really bad start. A hasty union, independence came, and immediately people were starting to get upset that things hadn't gone their way one way or another. And that was true in the North and the South. It wasn't just the Northerners who felt upset. So that 10 years, preparations for independence, the first thing there is, you know what? That preparation was pitifully inadequate, partly and largely because of the colonial powers. They didn't put anything like enough into developing it. That inadequacy, accompanied with huge enthusiasm for union, independence, meant that people rushed into it without doing the things that they should have done, that they would have known they needed to do had they had the capacity, the political experience to have had that understanding. So it meant that the union was kind of cursed from the beginning. Meanwhile, the French, at the same time, were busy playing their own politics to try and make sure that Djibouti never joined Somalia, and that Djibouti remained French as long as possible. And they were quite successful at doing that by playing off, essentially, the Afar against the Somalis in Djibouti. They had two of their own referendums, one in this time, when they rejected independence and they rejected union with Somalia. So the French were very good at playing their own politics in their own territory. The Kenyans, of course, at that time, at the end of the colonial period, there was a big movement in the northern districts, NFD, NEF, of Kenya to join Somalia. And the British canvassed people there and confirmed that, in fact, the majority by far wanted union with Somalia, but the Kenyans were having nothing of it. And the British at that stage were too weak to be able to really put up a strong argument. So in the end, it was because the Kenyans, having newly gained independence and the process of independence, refused to countenance a possibility there would be any part of what had become Kenya by then becoming a part of Somalia. So that independence, that preparation for independence, the post-independence period, was marked by huge disappointments, where the idea of Somaliland originally, of course, was built on the 5 parts of Somalia. Those 5 parts, one by one, started dropping off. You got Djibouti going away. Ethiopia was never going to let go of the Ogaden. Kenya would refuse absolutely to countenance any possibility of Kenyan Somalis joining Somalia. So it only left Somaliland and Somalia in the south. So that was the independent period. He ended up being, his government ended up starting being torn apart by exactly the same clan-based issues that had caused the 1969 election to be as problematic as it was. So he saw himself as basically Kemal Ataturk for Somalia. He saw himself as a modernizing leader of an Islamic country who was going to introduce a new Somali script, which he did. He was going to introduce new rights for women, which he did. But in so doing, he caused huge controversy with the family law and with the imprisonment and execution of a number of members of clerics who opposed him and their supporters. So he quickly started to find that things started to unravel. At the same time, the problems in Somaliland were growing, and the problems in Puntland, because as much as he started falling back on the Marihan, Ogaden, Dobahanti triumvirate of clans, the Majaten, so some people would say, okay, there's a Darod thing going on there, but the Majaten were not happy with that at all. And the first armed insurgent group to come up against him came from Puntland, from the Majaten, and that was the SSDF. Now, in the meantime, as things were starting to fracture, people were starting to get really upset with him. People were starting to see either that he was doing things that they didn't consider religiously acceptable, or things that they felt were undermining the clan structure. The one thing that he was able to call on to try and reunite people was the same as what other people had done before, which was to go back to the idea of Somaliland. So invading Ethiopia in 1977 was all about trying to rescue his government at a time when he was losing grip. And at that stage, it seemed, in hindsight, it seems like a huge miscalculation. Ethiopia and Somalia were both reliant on the Soviet Union. If you go and attack someone that's supported by the superpower that's supporting you, you know there's going to be a problem, surely. And one of the really kind of depressing stories is about when he went to Moscow to try and win support for his side of the argument from the Soviet Union, and was completely ignored by the powers in the Kremlin and humiliated at a time when he was trying to persuade them that they should support him. And there are Kremlin memos from the time mocking him as being this useless leader that had come and tried and beg for support from them. So he seemed really not to be capable of playing the politics that he needed to play. Mengistu, for all his huge faults, was a lot better at playing the politics. And so he was the one that won the Soviet support, and Siad Barre's dream really ended in 1977 with defeat in that war, even though it was some years later before his government actually fell. It was a slow, it was not a slow decline, it was a pretty fast decline from there. By 1978, 1 year later, the SSDF was formed. 1979-80, the SNM started to come together in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, and in London. In 1981, they joined together in a meeting here, in a pub just up the road. So those groups, those insurgent groups, started to become a real force working against Siad Barre's operation. And of course, in Somalilanders know Dagator, the stone throwing, when students were throwing stones at the trial of the people that were trying to help to reinvigorate, to rehabilitate Hargeisa Hospital, became a huge turning point in terms of the Somaliland struggle, the Somaliland, the SNM struggle against Siad Barre. And from there, it was really rapid decline. So from the 1980s, okay, one more thing that was important there. Mengistu, meanwhile, had an insurgent problem in the north of Ethiopia. He had the Tigrayans and the Eritreans uniting to fight his government. Siad Barre had the Northerners, SSDF, SNM, and new groups like the USC in the south starting to fight against him. They were both supporting each other's insurgent groups. They couldn't keep doing that because they needed desperately to try and regain control of their own countries, so those two did a deal. And that was what led the SNM to be forced out of Ethiopia, and they made the fateful decision whether to disband, give up, or move offshore again back to London or wherever, or to attack and try and impose themselves in Somaliland. And they chose the latter. And at the time, it was a hugely risky operation. So they went and took Barre and Hargeisa cities. That was what led Siad Barre to then bomb those two cities. They successfully took the cities off his soldiers. That was a big moment. His response was to bomb the two of them as flat as he could. And with Hargeisa, he followed the bombing up with artillery shells and troops walking through the streets told to shoot everyone they saw. So that was the point. As brutal as that was, and as effective as that was in emptying those two cities of people, that was the point he'd completely lost control. Because after that, actually, he didn't have the ability to continue to control those territories. The SNM came back, and the SNM was able to take over the whole of Somaliland and start doing these deals with the people in the east and the west, and that was the end of his regime.